All right, strap in, everyone, because we are about to warp into a deep dive on Star Trek Enterprise. If you're listening, I think it's safe to say you are looking to get up to speed on this corner of the Star Trek world. Well, you've come to the right place. We'll get you there.
That's right, we're your guides through the Enterprise timeline, ready to point out the major storylines and characters, and maybe even unearth some behind-the-scenes nuggets along the way.
So, to really understand Enterprise, we've got to lay down some groundwork first. Unlike some other Star Trek series, this one is a prequel. It takes us back a whole century before Kirk, Spock, and the Enterprise we all know. It's the story of Earth's first Warp 5 starship, the NX-01, going out into a galaxy that's mostly uncharted territory for humans at this point.
I think the really cool thing about a prequel like this is that we get to experience those first encounters with species like the Klingons and Andorians from a completely fresh perspective. This isn't the super polished diplomatic federation we're used to seeing. This is a much more raw, uncertain humanity, just dipping their toes into the galactic pond.
It's almost like watching those old films of the first moon landing, You get that same sense of wonder and excitement, but also a little bit of, whoa, what are we getting ourselves into?
Exactly. And speaking of things being a little rough around the edges, the technology in Enterprise is definitely more basic compared to later series. Forget tractor beams, they're still using grappler cables here. No fancy replicators either. The chef has to work with actual, real ingredients.
Oh, man. Can you imagine the complaints about rehydrated space potatoes after, a month out there?
Probably. And let's not forget about the universal translators everyone just takes for granted later on.
Yeah.
In Enterprise, it's Hoshi Sato, the linguist, who has the incredibly tough job of deciphering alien languages on the fly.
Talk about pressure. But let's talk about those venturing out into the galaxy. At the helm, we've got Captain Jonathan Archer, played by Scott Bakula. I've always been a fan of Bakula. He brings this great blend of boyish enthusiasm and gravitas to the role, don't you think?
Definitely. And I think what makes Archer such a fascinating captain is he's this test pilot, pushing the boundaries, but also kind of a regular guy, just trying to figure things out as he goes. You really feel that with Bakula in the role.
And then you've got T-Pole, played by Jolene Blalock. She's Vulcan, assigned by the High Command. I always saw her role as basically making sure these humans don't, accidentally start a war with somebody.
That's a good way to put it. But T'Pol's more than a babysitter, She really represents the careful, skeptical side of a more advanced species, watching humanity take its first steps into space. Those scenes with her and Archer with their totally different approaches to things, those are great. A lot of tension and humor there.
I can see that. All right, and then there's Trip Tucker, the chief engineer, played by Connor Trinneer. He's Archer's good buddy from way back,
Right.
Brings that southern charm to the bridge. And honestly, I think he really grows over the course of the show.
People often call Trip the heart of Enterprise, and I get that. It's not just because he's the engineer. Remember that episode where he's willing to risk his own life to save that alien kid, even though it's totally against protocol? Yeah, that's Trip compassionate, goes the extra mile for people.
Yeah, great example. And of course, it wouldn't be a Starship crew without a good supporting cast, right? We've got Malcolm Reed, the, let's say, very by-the-book tactical officer. Travis Mayweather, our helmsman, who has the unique distinction of being born in space.
Imagine growing up on a cargo freighter, constantly going between star systems. I mean, it makes sense that Travis would bring a totally different view to the crew, having grown up around so many different alien cultures.
Absolutely. And of course, Dr. Phlox, the Denobulan doctor, always good for some outlandish medical techniques, always a good laugh.
Yeah.
But also, he really shows just how open-minded you have to be when you're dealing with alien physiology.
You go in for a checkup with Phlox and you might leave with leeches, alien spores, a song or two, who knows. Definitely one of the most memorable characters.
No doubt.
Yeah.
But Enterprise isn't all just, standalone episodes, right? I mean, there are those big overarching storylines that run through the seasons, right?
Totally. And I think one of the most interesting but maybe initially confusing elements is the temporal Cold War. It's this big, shadowy conflict playing out over centuries with groups from the future messing around in the past, trying to change things for their own reasons.
So like a time travel thriller on top of everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And they do a great job of keeping you guessing because just when you think you understand who's who and what they want, something happens that turns it all upside down. And then there's the Xindi arc in season 3. This one really changes things up, Suddenly the Enterprise crew is in a race against time after a huge attack on Earth.
Oh yeah, the Xindi arc. This is the one that I've heard so much about. It's a really big change from those earlier episodes, right?
Yeah, it's a lot more like one big story playing out instead of, wrapping things up at the end of every episode. Each episode leads into the next one as the crew goes into this uncharted area of space called the Delphic Expanse. They've got to find the Shindy and stop them from attacking again.
So instead of like a reset button every episode, it's one continuous mission.
Exactly. And what makes the Shindy arc so interesting is that it really forces the crew to look at their own prejudices and deal with how complicated it can be when you've got conflict between all these different species. The Shindys aren't just like one big enemy, they're a bunch of different species with their own problems and reasons for doing things.
That sounds intense. But even with all that action and drama, Enterprise still finds a way to start setting up the Federation. That big alliance we see in all the later Star Trek series.
Right. We start to see those first partnerships between humans, Vulcans, Andorians, and Tellarites. They're laying the foundation for a time when different species can work together for the greater good. It's a good reminder that the Federation didn't just happen overnight. It took individuals choosing to overcome their differences and build something better.
So even though it's a prequel, Enterprise is kind of setting the stage for everything that happens after, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of setting the stage, we should probably talk about some of the things that happened behind the scenes that made Enterprise stand out, for better or worse. You know the theme song.
Faith of the Heart, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's my favorite Star Trek theme, but people definitely talked about it a lot.
I'll just say it was a bold choice to go with that contemporary pop sound instead of the usual orchestral stuff. Some people liked it, some didn't. But it definitely gave the show a different vibe.
And then there's the fact that Enterprise was way ahead of its time with technology.
Yeah.
Season 3, they switched over to filming in high definition, which back then was pretty cutting edge.
Yeah, and it really makes a difference visually, especially if you're watching it now. Those later seasons have a much richer look to them.
Of course, we can't forget that Enterprise got canceled after just 4 seasons. Some of those storylines just kind of stopped. But maybe that's part of the fun, leaves you wanting more.
Maybe. It's always fun to think about what might have been. Okay, I think we need to address the Klingon issue here.
Yeah.
Fans of the original series were pretty quick to point out that the Klingons in Enterprise look a lot different, right? They've got those big forehead ridges that were in the original show.
Right. The big Klingon conundrum, I remember.
At first, they just said it was because makeup and prosthetics had gotten better over time. But they ended up addressing it in the show with a story about a genetic engineering plague that changed how Klingons look.
A plague, huh?
Yeah.
That seems kind of like a stretch to me. But I guess they needed some explanation.
It definitely shows how hard it can be to keep things consistent across a franchise as big as Star Trek, especially when you're doing a prequel and going back to stuff that's already been established.
True. But aside from those continuity things, what really stands out to you about Enterprise? What makes it different from all the other Star Trek shows?
I think for me, it's that feeling of vulnerability and discovery. We're seeing humanity at a much earlier stage of their journey into space.
Mm-hmm.
Their technology's not as good, they're not as smooth with diplomacy, and the stakes are so much higher because everything they do could have really big consequences.
I see that. They're really out there on their own, figuring things out as they go, which you don't get as much in the later shows where Starfleet's already established and running things smoothly.
That's right. And because of that, the stories feel really raw and immediate, which I think makes it super interesting. But I'm curious, what about you? What's grabbing your attention about Enterprise so far?
Well, besides the whole Klingon forehead thing, I'm really interested in the idea of a prequel that explores the beginnings of Starfleet. We all know where they end up with the Federation and everything, but to see those first steps and the struggles along the way, I think that's fascinating.
I totally agree. And it makes you think about where we are now, in the present.
Oh, how so?
But think about it. If Enterprise is a prequel set before the Federation and the Prime Directive, does that mean they're freer to, act a little less evolved?
That's a good point. They don't have to follow those same rules we see later on. Mm-hmm. So are they more like pioneers, blazing their own trail, even if it means making some tough choices?
Exactly. And that can lead to some really thought-provoking moral dilemmas. There are times when they're incredibly brave and clever, but then other times when what they do has unexpected and sometimes bad results.
So it's not just about spaceships and aliens. It's also about exploring what it means to be human, our potential for good and bad, and how hard it is to navigate a universe that's so complex and dangerous.
Exactly. And those themes are something we can all relate to no matter when or where the story takes place. But let's talk about some specific episodes. Do you have any favorites that come to mind?
Well, I've always been drawn to those episodes that really dive into the ethical stuff, and Dear Doctor from season 1 is a great example of that.
Yeah, that's the one where Phlox has to decide whether to cure a deadly disease that's affecting one of two subspecies on this planet, knowing that if he does, it could change how they evolve.
Right, right. It's that classic Star Trek dilemma. Should we get involved even if we think we're doing the right thing?
And it really gets you thinking about the Prime Directive, even though they don't really call it that yet in Enterprise.
Then there's Shockwave, the two-parter at the end of season 1 and beginning of season 2. That one was a real game changer. It really brings in the temporal Cold War in a big way.
And it's a shift to a more serialized format, which continues into the Shindy arc in season 3.
Oh, yeah, that whole Delphic expanse thing was crazy spatial anomalies,
Yeah.
weird alien life forms, danger around every corner.
It really pushed the crew to their limits. And the Sindhi themselves, they weren't just your average bad guys, They had their own reasons for what they were doing, their own internal conflicts and everything.
Okay, so we've talked about all the serious stuff, but Enterprise also had those fun, lighter episodes, where the crew got to take a break and we got to see a different side of them. Any standouts for you in that category?
2 Days and Two Nights from season 2 always comes to mind. It's basically a shore leave episode where the crew takes a little vacation on Risa, the pleasure planet.
Risa, huh? I've heard things. What's that all about?
Let's just say the reasons are very relaxed about everything. Tropical beaches, fun drinks, and a lot of romance. It's a chance for the crew to unwind, and we get to see some funny interactions and, maybe some sparks flying between certain crew members.
Sounds like a nice change of pace from all the galaxy saving.
Yeah.
Any other episodes you'd recommend for a good time?
If you're into the whole mirror universe thing, with evil twins and alternate realities, then In a Mirror Darkly from season 4 is a must-watch. It's a two-parter.
Oh, yeah, the Mirror Universe. That's
Yeah.
a classic Star Trek thing. What makes the Enterprise version different?
Well, instead of being about the Enterprise crew's evil counterparts, it focuses on the Terran Empire, capturing a really powerful starship from the regular universe. It's got a lot of action, a lot of twists and turns.
And those Terran Empire uniforms. So cool. Okay, we've talked about the crew, the storylines, the memorable episodes. Anything else we should cover before we wrap up this part?
I think it's important to remember that even though Enterprise ended after just 4 seasons, it still had a big impact on Star Trek. It introduced some new ideas and species that they've used in later shows, and it really helped to flesh out the history of the whole universe.
Right. They added a lot to what we already knew.
Yeah.
And even though it didn't get that, magic 7 seasons, it still told some really great stories and explored some interesting themes.
Definitely. And if anyone out there wants to learn about the early days of Starfleet and how the Federation came to be, I definitely recommend checking out Enterprise.
Okay, we've covered a lot of territory here. Before we warp out of this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. So we've talked about Enterprise as this prequel to the other shows,
Yeah.
but it was also a show that came out in the early 2000s, Do you think it was maybe commenting on some of the anxieties people were feeling back then about things like technology and space exploration and where we fit in the universe?
Oh, yeah. I think you're right on the money there. It's important to remember that Enterprise premiered not that long after 9/11. I mean, that was a time of huge uncertainty and change all over the world. And then here comes this show about humanity, still finding its way, venturing out into this galaxy that can be dangerous and unpredictable. They're facing threats they don't even understand. I think there are definitely some parallels there, right?
So it's like the show was reflecting some of those fears that people had, but maybe also some of their hopes for the future, right?
Yeah, I think so. The idea of exploring space, making first contact, maybe even fighting or cooperating with other cultures, those were all big things that people were thinking about. And Enterprise tackled those themes in a way that felt both current for back then, but also timeless,
And you can't ignore the whole technology angle either. In Enterprise, we see humans still figuring out how to handle things like warp drive. It lets them explore the galaxy, yeah, but it also puts them in more danger.
It's a trade-off, for sure. And Enterprise doesn't shy away from showing the downsides of technology. Think about the weapons they start developing that could wipe out entire planets. It's pretty scary when you think about it.
Absolutely. And it's not just the technology, right? There are so many ethical dilemmas that come up in the show. The crew's always having to make tough calls, often without enough info, and there's never a clear-cut right answer. They have to figure out how to interact with cultures that are totally different from their own, how to balance what they need with what others need. It's tricky.
And those are questions we're still asking today in our own world. Look at what we're facing now: climate change, globalization, how fast technology is changing.
So, in a way, Enterprise isn't just about the past. It's like it's looking at the present, maybe even giving us a glimpse of what could be coming in the future.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it such a powerful show, even after all these years. It makes us ask big questions about our place in the universe, about the choices we make, both as individuals and as a species.
Well said. Sounds like Enterprise is more than just a prequel. It's like a launch pad for some serious conversations about, well, everything. We've boarded the NX-01, met the crew, explored those first missions for Starfleet, even took a little trip to that mirror universe.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. Hopefully you're feeling ready to, really dive into Enterprise yourself.
Yeah, think so. And who knows, maybe you'll come up with some questions and ideas of your own along the way. Until next time, live long and prosper.
And may your journey through the Star Trek universe be full of adventure and discovery.